welcome to Jewish Gen and this extraordinary talk today on the portrait of Süßkind. I am, for those one or two of you who don't know me, I'm Karen Franklin. I'm in this capacity the Director of Outreach for Jewish Gen. And we want to especially thank our co-sponsors who will introduce themselves in just a few moments and also talk briefly about the organizations that they are representing. The impetus for this program came from a talk I did some months ago when I spoke about the narrow focus of much of the research on Anne Frank, that many studies about her focus on her Frankfurt and Amsterdam experiences as an assimilated Jew. And these studies missed the opportunity to delve into her complex and rich ancestry, which can easily be traced back to the 1200s, both in Germany and throughout Europe. Dr. Ralph Stern contacted me after hearing about the talk that I gave on this topic and told me about the research that he was doing, tracing a portrait of Anne's ancestor and his, which required tracking her ancestors throughout Germany. And his talk explains how genealogy was part of the provenance research he performed. So before we get to Ralph, we're going to introduce the rest of our co-sponsors for the event. And let's start, David Brown, with you and the Leo Baeck Institute.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks to Jewish Gen and the Anne Frank Center for joining us in this program. My name is David Brown. I'm Director of Public History at the Leo Baeck Institute, which, as most of you know, but maybe not all of you, is a library and archive here in New York at the Center for Jewish History, focused on the history of German-speaking Jews. And so, as the Anne Frank exhibit has been open at the Center for Jewish History, we've been trying to do programming that focuses on the German-Jewish context of Anne Frank's family. Of course, we do many other things. So since I have the opportunity, I'll just plug a couple highlights. We just opened an exhibit on Laura Siegel, who, of course, is the beloved novelist and short story writer, also author of children's books, who passed away last year and was born in 1928 in Vienna and survived on a kinder transport, and then wrote many wonderful books. And you can learn more about her work and her life at Leo Baeck Institute right now through April 15th. And we also have a lot of great programming. So check our website, lbi.org, about that. And in addition to sponsoring talks like this, we also produce a podcast. And I'm excited to announce that we have new episodes coming up starting the second half of February. I think February 21st is the launch date for new episodes of Exile, which is now hosted by the actor Joshua Malina, who you might remember from The West Wing, or if you saw Leopoldstadt on Broadway, he was also Hermann Merz, the patriarch. And those are stories from our archives centered around the forced emigration and the experience of exile and displacement, but also always showing the context going back centuries of Jewish life in German-speaking lands. And I look forward to hearing more about that today from Ralph Stern. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, David. And also want to acknowledge Jenny Rappaport, who's a genealogist at the Ackman Ziff Genealogy Institute at the Center for Jewish History. Welcome, Jenny.
Hi. My talk basically is 2 seconds or so to tell you that I am the head genealogist at the Center for Jewish History, and we love helping people research their family history, and we are delighted to be asked to collaborate as part of this program. In particular, as David mentioned, the Leo Baeck Institute is one of our partner organizations. We have 4 other partner organizations at the Center for Jewish History: YIVO, the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, and the Yeshiva University Museum. We have been honored over the last year to collaborate with the Anne Frank House to host Anne Frank, the exhibit. And we have recently at the Genealogy Institute started the Histories and Mysteries Initiative, which is a social impact project focused on Holocaust education. It's funded by the Claims Conference. Excuse me. Our aim with this is to try to help people solve lingering Holocaust era mysteries in their family, such as, your grandfather's sister was with the partisans in Belarus, but what happened to her when she was there? Or you've inherited a family photo and you know one of the people in the photo and not anybody else in the photo. And we hope to help through both archival research and a little bit of crowdsourcing for things like the photos to help you find answers to these mysteries. And if you would like to participate in the project, you can scan the QR code on the screen or go to cjh.org/histories-mysteries. And I wanted to say thank you once again to JewishGen for collaborating and inviting me to help host this lecture, as well as Ralph Stern, who's giving the lecture, our partner organization, the Leo Baeck Institute, and the Anne Frank Center USA.
Thank you, Jenny. And I also want to welcome Dr. Lauren, I can never pronounce your name too well, Bainsfather, from the Anne Frank House Institute Center, whatever. We'll let you say it properly, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Karen. I'll just jump in. And first of all, amazing to hear what you all are working on. And I'm so moved, Jenny, by that project to trace the stories of people's families during the Holocaust. Incredible. So I am Dr. Lauren Bairnsfather. I'm the CEO of the Anne Frank Center USA. So we've clarified that. At the Anne Frank Center USA, we believe in the power of young people to change the world. So for that reason, our primary activity is bringing programs into schools in New York and across the United States. And we currently have a grant from UJA New York to offer programs in New York schools free of charge. So for anyone who's on this program now, a teacher at a Title I school or a school that faces financial hardship, then they would be eligible. You can email performances@annefrank.com or visit our website, which is annefrank.com. So a bit about our organization. We were founded in 1959 as Otto Frank sought funds to open the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam as a site of remembrance and education. So it's such an institution now, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. But there was a time when Otto Frank knew they couldn't open it. It couldn't be sustained without support from the United States. So that is our heritage at the Anne Frank Center USA. Upon learning of the diary and pursuing its publication, Otto Frank insisted on the universal appeal of the story. Karen brought us in by talking about the distance between Anne Frank's story that most people know and her Jewish history. And so this is something that is very important to us at the Anne Frank Center USA. In fact, we stand alone in the community of Anne Frank organizations by insisting on the centrality of Anne's Jewishness in telling her story. And I think of that as Lador Vador, from generation to generation. So I am so honored to be with all of you and to learn more about Anne's ancestor in Frankfurt and to be connected to all of the co-hosts on this program and the many people who are tuning in today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. And I just want to quickly read Dr. Stern's biography and also remind you that you can put any questions you have in the chat or talk about yourselves further if you so choose. But I think we're going to be mesmerized by this talk. Professor Stern is a former dean of the faculty, professor and former dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba, and he's taught in the United States and Europe. He lectures extensively, presenting research in the United States, for example, at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, MIT, the University of Chicago, and at universities throughout Europe. Ralph, welcome, and we anxiously await your talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. I wanted just to say in the very beginning of this talk that I am an academic. Often academic lectures are presenting an argument with one exception here. I am telling a story rather than presenting an argument. Pieces of this story have been told in various places at various times, but I would say that those pieces have never been really properly pulled together. Other things I'm presenting today for what I believe to be the very first time, And there are still open questions, and we'll address some of those open questions at the very end. So again, thank you to all of the co-hosts and sponsors for this. I feel incredibly honored to be here today and to be able to present this lecture, and a very special thanks to Karen Franklin for organizing all of this and being such an easy and generous person to work with throughout. So thank you, Karen. In the beginning, I wanted to also dedicate this talk to two individuals, the first of whom is Ilse Turnheim. And Ilse Turnheim's biography here is that she was born in Cologne, that she received her doctorate in Sozialpolitik from the University of Cologne. She worked at the Zentralwohlfahrtsstelle der Deutschen Juden from about 1928 to 1932. This institution was led by Leo Beck, and her immediate one over in Berlin and later in New York was Max Kreuzberger. So she was the archivist at the Leo Beck Institute from the late 1950s until the early 1980s in New York. And so I'm particularly pleased that I can actually say this at this point in time, that a lot of the documentation that I come across at the Leo Beck Institute when I work there, either online or in person in New York, that there are notes or references from Ilse Turnheim. Her daughter Frances and Frances's husband Herbert are alive and well on Manhattan's Upper East Side, and they have become two of my favorite people. And so it's especially nice just to have this connection all the way around in the context of this lecture today. My genealogical connection to Ilse Turnheim is through my great-grandmother, Johanna Stern. I also want to dedicate this talk to Alfred Lawrence. Alfred is shown here in his US military uniform. This is a photograph taken either in 1945 or 1946, and I'll return to Alfred a little bit later in the talk. My connection to Alfred is through my great-great-grandfather's second wife. And so I just wanted to show these connections. I find that the connections, the graphic devices yet shown by, or let's say as part of the Genie program, so my apologies to JewishGen for perhaps showing some of the competition here, but I find that these graphic devices are incredibly helpful in just showing these connections. Genealogies. I'm often asked if I'm connected with Fritz Stern, and actually when Fritz Stern passed away and a few years ago, I got an email from a former student saying, "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry for your loss." I am connected to Fritz Stern, but I really can't say that I'm related to Fritz Stern. This is often the case with German Jews, that it's a relatively small population of Jews in Germany, and it's a very well-documented population. And so here we have this relatively complex lateral connection to Fritz Stern, but it is only a connection, and he's not really a relation. I also wanted to say that I'm not connected to Selma Stern. Selma Stern would actually be, if I was connected to either of the two, would be someone that I'd prefer to be connected with. But again, it's a lateral connection, and I just wanted to show these in contrast to my connection to Süßkind Stern. So Süßkind Stern, this is straight down, right? He is my sixth great-grandfather, and it Sterns all the way down. And because this lecture is also held in the context of Anna Frank, I wanted just to show the connection then to Anna Frank. And it's until the Franks get involved, it's also Sterns all the way down on that side of the family. So Anna Frank is actually a seventh cousin. This is a blood relationship, one generation removed. She's actually, in this case, one generation removed ahead of me. That had to do with the people in Frankfurt, the families in Frankfurt, marrying younger and having children at a younger age than the ones in Zost that you will see that we come to later. The pivotal figure, of course, in Anna Frank's biography is her grandmother, who was born Elise Stern and then married Michael Frank, and that is where the lineage of the Frank family then begins. Anna is very well aware of Elise, and we will come back to that later. The portrait, to put the portrait itself in context, the portrait has not been published very much. The question is, who is Süßkind? And we see at the top of this page, this is a page taken out of the Elle Toldot, and here it is available on JewishGen. It's available in different formats from different platforms as well today. And here we have some information about Süßkind. And what I wanted to point out in this regard is there's two children here. I assume you can see my cursor here, that we have Jakob Stern, and that is from whom I descend. And we have Mendele Stern, his slightly younger brother. And we can see that Mendele Stern is then establishes the branch of the family that leads down to Anna Frank. The portrait itself has been published on occasion. This is the first known publication of it, of which I'm aware. This was published in 1971 in a small publication called the Soester Zeitschrift. This is a publication of the Historical Society in the little town of Soest. And it's published together with the image of Jonathan Eibeschutz. And the juxtaposition is actually a very interesting juxtaposition because these two portraits were together for a very long period of time, perhaps 200 years or so. And you can see the condition of the Süßkind portrait in this black and white photograph. I'm not sure what the origin of this particular photograph was. Süßkind, the portrait was photographed in the early 1920s. I have never seen that photograph. That photograph did exist until at least the 1960s or 70s. I don't believe that photograph was ever published, however. So it is quite possible that this is the first publication of this, what is a very important portrait in many ways. It's published again by Alfred Lawrence, who I have already introduced to you, and there's a color version that's published in the Leo Baeck Yearbook of 1973, the Leo Baeck Institute of London Yearbook of 1973. And there is a lengthy article associated with it, which is something of a repetition of an earlier article, the 1971 article, but also tends to go in a somewhat different direction. It's published again in 1992 by Ruth Gay in this book, The Jews of Germany, which is actually quite a wonderful book. And here it's published in the hardbound version of the book in a color insert, and it's juxtaposed with Moses Mendelssohn. So Süßkind kept good company at any rate in publications. And it's published again in Miriam Presler's Anne Frank's Family in the English edition, at least in the digital edition, and I imagine in the softbound edition as well. And we'll return to this book later on. And it is published now and readily available, widely available on the website of the Jewish Museum of Frankfurt and the Museum Judengasse Frankfurt. There are two museums which are allied under one umbrella. And here I also want to say a special thank you to the Jewish Museum of Frankfurt and the Judengasse Museum, because they've been very helpful to me in doing this work and very supportive of how this is now unfolding. This is the portrait as it appears today. And this is the portrait in situ, and we will come back to that in a minute, where it is. So that's the first question. Where is the portrait today? And the portrait is in Frankfurt's Judengasse. And so just a discussion about the Judengasse. This is an image of the, let's say, an imagined but relatively accurate, but not completely accurate, image of Frankfurt from 1628. And the Judengasse is this curved arc at this part of the city. And we'll come back to that now quite a number of times. I just wanted to juxtapose this image where you can see the defensive fortifications around the city of Frankfurt with a Google Earth image from today, where you can still see very much the traces of what had been that defensive perimeter around Frankfurt, including these, let's say, Baroque triangular fortifications. And of course, the green belt is what had once been the moat surrounding the historical city of Frankfurt. And so here, just to show you again what that looks like in 1628, zooming in, we have the Judengasse here. This was a ghetto. And this is the question of how you define a ghetto has its own particular histories, not to be sort of delved into here. But there were three gates into the ghetto, one at the top, one at the bottom, and one in the middle. And those gates would be closed off at night or on Christian holidays, and Jews were to remain in the ghetto. The ghetto grew a little bit in this direction over time. This area in the back is where the cemetery is actually located, and I'll come back to the cemetery a number of times. This is a plan of the ghetto. This was drawn in the early 18th century, and it's really a remarkable document showing the long linear plots, let's say, of the houses within the Jewish ghetto and the site of the main synagogue. And this synagogue has its own particular history. It was burned a few times. It was rebuilt in the middle of the 19th century. But if we zoom into that, you will see here's the synagogue. And you can see, I'll just sort of focus in on this a little bit. You can see here that this is, that these houses all have names. And so this house is simply called the Kanne, the pitcher. This is called the golden pitcher. And this is called the Weißer Stern. And this means the white star. And Jews in the ghetto, historically in Germany, Jews were often named for the cities from whence they came. In the ghetto, because of the density of Jews and the repetition of names, they then took on the names of the houses in which they lived. That's often the case. And we can see that there are three houses named after trees here: the Buchsbaum house, the Apfelbaum, the apple tree, and the Bernbaum, the pear tree. And so I imagine historically there was an orchard here, and that the orchard then became these three houses, and the houses were named after the trees in the orchard. Süßkind is named after this house. That is where his name comes from. The Rothschilds are named after, again, a house in the ghetto. Rothschild in German is Rothschild, and Rothschild means red sign. And so the Rothschild family is named after the house with the red sign. So that is how German names or German Jewish names came to be within the ghetto in Frankfurt, the Judengasse. And here we see just under, again, we're coming back to this document from the Ella Toldo, the house, the golden Kanne, the golden pitcher, and then ultimately, without translating all of this, the house, the Weißer Stern. And that is how Süßkind Stern, originally he's named Süßkind zum Stern, or the Süßkind Schnur zum Stern, which means Süßkind to this house. And then over time, it just simply became elided as Süßkind Stern. Süßkind Stern is the first time the name Stern is associated with this family. His father is named Jakob Bingen. And so once again, this is named after the small town of Bingen, which is not too far from Frankfurt. And if you, depending upon which genealogy you go back, because Frankfurt is so well documented, whether it's the Bingen lineage or whether it is Süßkind's mother's lineage, it's actually possible for me to go back to my 12th great-grandfather, which is something that maybe not too many people can say, that you can actually go back that far. But the first Stern is actually Süßkind Stern. So there's an importance connected with this individual in establishing that particular lineage. And here, just one more time, just so that you can see this Weißer Stern. Coming back to the overall, you can see the synagogue here, you can see this group of houses here. And you can see what this area of Frankfurt looks like today. And the question, of course, arises, is any of this left? And by and large, the answer would have to be no, absolutely not. But you can see I've mapped on the Judengasse more or less to scale with the contemporary, let's say, street pattern. The entire street pattern is different in Frankfurt today. And you can see that there is just a little bit of this curvature here, which reflects the curvature in the Judengasse. And oddly, where this original synagogue was, where the Hauptsynagogue was, is where the city planning department now exists in a modern high-rise. So this is an image from the middle of the 19th century when the Judengasse is already being demolished here, partially demolished. So in this case, these houses at the bottom are all gone. And so you're seeing the houses, let's say, to the east with the Hauptsynagogue at the end. And this shows you what those buildings were like at that point in time. They were very narrow, very deep buildings. They would have courtyards in the back. But this was a very, very dense urban situation. And historically, the street in the Jugendgasse would just be a few meters wide, maybe 6 meters wide or something like that, with these very, very tall buildings. So you can imagine this was an incredibly dense, congested, and very much lively area. Again, just coming back to this image one more time and showing this historically now, this is from the second half of the 19th century as these houses were being demolished. And you see how small and dense these houses are in comparison to townhouses, much more modern townhouses, which were built in the middle of the 19th century, where it's already this kind of erasure of the historical building substance of Frankfurt. And what we see here as a kind of historical overview is that this is an aerial photograph from 1920, and we see here the Hauptsynagogue, and we see here the new synagogue. And there's a reason I'm showing the new synagogue as well. Here again, the Hauptsynagogue, and then the new synagogue. Here we see the Hauptsynagogue from a street view, and you can see the change in the types of buildings here from the middle of the 19th century, late 19th century. This is what the Rothschild house would have looked like in the middle of the 19th century. And you can see these much older, sort of, almost late medieval structures on the far side of the synagogue. The new synagogue is one, and why I wanted to show this is because it's frequently imaged, and many people may have a connection to this. The new synagogue is connected to, it was built at this end here. There was an area here called the Judenmarkt, the Jewish market. And so here we see the Jewish market in action, and we see the new synagogue as it is recently completed at the very end of the 19th century. And we see here the trees of the cemetery. And again, I'll come back to the cemetery. Here we see it in a postcard view. And here we see it on Reichskristallnacht. So this is the image that may be familiar to many people. There aren't many synagogues that were photographed during the pogrom of November 1938. Essen is a synagogue that's often imaged. There are synagogues in Berlin that are imaged, the synagogue in the Fasanenstraße. But this one is frequently imaged, and that's why I wanted to reference this. Here you see the ruins of the synagogue, one more image of the ruin of the synagogue. And here we see an image of Frankfurt, either from the summer of 1945, though possibly 1946. And you see here at the bottom the footprint of the synagogue. And these are all American military trucks, right? So Frankfurt was very much in the American occupation zone. And here we see it again, looking in the other direction, this area where the synagogue had once been. This part of the Judengasse is completely gone, but we do see the cemetery in the back here. This is what the aerial looks like today, and there is no trace of any of this, with the exception of the cemetery. There is a vague footprint that's sort of marked out in gravel of the synagogue. So it's difficult to sort of visualize this because this has been worked over so many times. There is a memorial here. The wall around the cemetery is another memorial. And there is a plaque, let's say, on the wall of this largely office building that says that on this location, on what is now called not the Judenmarkt anymore, but the Borneplatz, that this is where the new synagogue actually stood. There's a similar marking for the Hauptsynagogue, the older synagogue as well, on the other end, let's say, of what had once been the Judengasse. So the cemetery, and this is a photograph of 1906 or circa 1906. The cemetery looked like this. It looks very much like a Jewish cemetery. It looks very much like you might see in Prague. These are relatively simple Baroque gravestones. They're not the elaborate stones that were then used to mark Jewish graves later on in the 19th and early 20th century. This is what it looks like today. And a great deal of this material was destroyed, but a large amount of this material was also saved. So this is from last summer. This is what the cemetery looks like. And what you see on all of these gravestones, what's so remarkable, are the symbols that are connected with the houses from which the people who were buried here originally came, right? So here we have a picture, and here we have a cornucopia, and there are lots of other images of ladders and the like. And in the cemetery, we also have the gravestone of Süßkind. And in this case, the reference is back to the House of the Golden Pitcher, right? So this is something that is engraved on his gravestone. It's not in the original location. It's adjacent to the perimeter wall. It's obviously suffered, but it's still extant, which is also quite remarkable. So it's just probably located off just to the top of this image here, this Google Earth image of this building. So the building is very interesting because this was constructed in the 1980s, largely as an office building. But when excavations were undertaken for the office building, the foundations of the houses of the original Judengasse were uncovered. And the developer for this project initially, there was something like 15 houses that were uncovered. And the developer simply wanted to take out these old foundations and build his new office building. And this precipitated a great amount of resistance in Frankfurt, a lot of protests against this kind of work. And you can see here just the sign on, or there's the graffiti, actually, the lettering on this billboard. Hier steht ein Geschichtsentsorgungspark. Here will be built a history disposal park, right? So very much against this eradication, this final erasure of the Judengasse. And here is basically a sort of a rhyming couplet that if you get rid of the Judenstadt, you can also get rid of the Goethehaus. So, you can't valorize one part of Frankfurt's history and erase another part of Frankfurt's history. So ultimately, the building was built, but as you can see, this is where the museum Judengasse is located. And if you sort of come up to the Judengasse, what is on the exterior wall to the Borneplatz is essentially a lithograph of that photograph that I showed you earlier of the Judengasse itself. This is not quite in the right location, but it really makes the point that this is what was once there. So it's actually a remarkable effort on the part of Frankfurt and just the success of the protests in making this realizable. What happened is that many of the foundations were removed. They have become something of a memorial themselves. But 6 foundations were actually retained, and those then become the basis of the excavation, let's say the archaeological excavation of the museum Judengasse. And so here we see what this house would have looked like originally, the floor plan of the house, and what you are looking at here are the foundations of these houses. You're literally looking back onto what those foundations actually were. This is looking in the other direction. That little model is in the very back here. And so this office building is built above this archaeological dig, which is essentially the Museum Judengasse. And it is in this location that the portrait is now placed. And so it's quite a remarkable sort of position for this portrait as a sort of, I don't know, as a kind of anchor, as the image of the person who lived in this Judengasse. And for me, it's also a remarkable story. And that's why this became such an interesting topic for me, as to why this, through all of this destruction, that this most fragile of things, this portrait actually survived. And we see in this portrait that this was a gift of the Horst Hoffmann family. So the question is, who is the Horst Hoffmann family? Who is Horst Hoffmann? So we come to the legend. And we know Miriam Presler has an exemplary reputation as bringing out, as basically, one of the translators, one of the most foremost translators of the Diary of Anne Frank. And we know from this diary as well that Elise Stern is Anne Frank's grandmother, right? And that Anne Frank herself writes that she comes from a very important and wealthy family. We see here, and this is what is so remarkable to me, is Miriam Presler, late in her life, wrote this book on Anne Frank's family. And she writes this passage the next time she, meaning Elise Stern, was sitting with Claire Schen, a relative, in the elegant salon of the Stern House in Frankfurt. She noticed the portrait of Süßkind Stern from 1671, the very first portrait of a Frankfurt Jew, as her uncle Bernhard liked to point out again and again. And she asks this question, apparently, did the Sterns used to be pious Jews? And so it is in this book that this portrait with its silver frame, as it now appears in the Judengasse, is shown. And the same passage appears in the German version of the book. And when I first read this passage, I just thought, wow, I'm sure you weren't expecting this slide, but there is this film for all those Americans who love their Westerns of the man who shot Liberty Valance. And the question by the reporter to Maxwell Scott, now a senator, is, you're not going to use the story, Mr. Scott, or the other way around. And the journalist, Maxwell Scott, says, no, sir, this is the West, sir. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. And so this is one of these tricky questions, right? I mean, this is, to me, this is the legend, right? This is not the fact, but it works well. And the portrait is in Frankfurt. And it basically closes a circle in a relatively clean and direct way. It becomes the legend. So let's look at the evidence here. So Frankfurt is at the bottom. The small town of Soest is not in the American West, but it's in Westphalia. It's about 250 kilometers distant. It would have been something like a 5-day carriage ride in the 17th and 18th century. And the evidence which we have, first of all, that is circumstantial, is that the Jewish ghetto burned in 1711. And that is a well-documented fact, that the Jewish ghetto essentially burned to the ground, and most especially that part of the ghetto in which the Stern House was located. So if the portrait had been in the ghetto in 1711, most likely it would have completely succumbed to the flames. And we come then, so that's circumstantial evidence, but the first real evidence we come to is the genealogy established by Marcus Aelius Marcus. Marcus Aelius Marcus is also related to the family. He is in the town of Soest. He is buried in the cemetery in the town of Soest, and he becomes the family's first genealogist. And Marcus Aurelius Marcus in 1847 produces this through, I mean, he hires somebody, of course, a graphic artist to do this incredible genealogical tree that basically anchors his family and its relationship to the Stern family in Soest. And he also puts together, which originally was on a continuous roll of paper and in the early 20th century was transcribed into a booklet form, a genealogy of the family as he sees it. And you can see the very first entry on the family, number one, is Süßkind, born 1610. And with this entry that in the house of Meyerstern in Soest, there is an oil painting, an oil portrait in a large format with the date 1671. And so we know that at least as of 1847, this portrait is definitely in Soest in the house of Meyer-Stern. And the house itself is very well documented, and the ownership of the house in the 19th century is very well documented. This is from 1830, and we can see here Meyer-Stern is entered at the bottom. So a short segue here, the Berlin connection. How do we get to Soest, and what does Berlin have to do with this? Berlin has a very complicated history with its Jewish population. This is an engraving essentially depicting the murder, right, of let's say, a large number of Jews who were accused of various things in 1510. And so they were condemned to be burned alive. And the other Jews in Berlin at that point in time in 1510 were ordered to leave not only Berlin, but to essentially leave all of what was then Brandenburg. Jews then came back again, and in the early part of the 17th century, in conjunction with the 30 Years' War, Jews were ordered to leave Frankfurt one more time, to leave Berlin one more time. And they were only allowed back into Berlin in 1671 when they were expelled from Vienna. So Berlin then said, well, if you have enough money and you don't do these sorts of businesses or those sorts of businesses, then some of you can come back to Berlin. So there's the beginnings of a Jewish community that is established in Berlin as of 1671. And one of those individuals who becomes very prominent in Berlin is Jost Liebmann. Jost Liebmann is married to two women. He is married, first of all, to Melke Hameln. So his wife is related to Gluckel von Hameln. And then his second wife is Esther Liebmann. He is working for the Kurfürst, for essentially the Prince of Brandenburg, Friedrich III. But in 1701, Friedrich III becomes King Frederick I. This is an image of his coronation in Königsberg. These are two representations of Friedrich. One as Friedrich III, as Kurfürst, as Prince, and secondly as King Friedrich I. And Friedrich, when he becomes king, he likes there's the only way to say it, he likes his bling. He likes jewels. He likes pearls. He likes the richness associated with the accoutrements of becoming the first king of Prussia. And so here we have the next connection, which is that Jost Liebmann's second wife is Esther Liebmann. And here we have this very wonderful, interesting article by Deborah Hertz, which is entitled The Despised Queen of Berlin, The Life and Times of Esther Liebmann. This may or may not be a portrait of Jost Liebmann. It's unclear. Some sources say yes, some sources say maybe. So where this becomes interesting is, who is Esther Liebmann and why is she despised? And there's this wonderful article by Selma Stern published in 1925, where she refers to Esther Liebmann as a born politician, clever and diplomatic, and almost consumed by a burning ambition. She has been the head of a clique that is completely dependent on her for years. She is the object of hatred for the rest of the Berlin community, who fear and persecute her, yet submit to her tyrannical nature and strong will. She dominates her sons-in-law, her stepson, and her friends. She obtains trade concessions and letter of protection for them. Esther Liebman is a powerful figure. Her husband dies in 1702. She takes over the business. The king is indebted to her to quite a large amount. At a certain point, it becomes something like 70,000 Reichsthaler. So she's a powerful person, and the king owes her something. And so what we find here then is this very interesting note here that Wolf Benjamin Liebman is, according to the Act of Berlin, the youngest son of Jost Liebman, right? So the husband of Esther Liebman, and that he receives in 1704 the right to settle in Soest. So why am I talking about Liebman? This is a story about Stern. So the connection here is that in Soest there is a document. This is the original, let's say, document giving the privilege to, as we can see here, Wolf Benjamin Liebman to settle in Soest. Soest was a town, like so many towns in Westphalia under Prussian control, that allowed two protected Jews or two protected Jewish families to reside in the town, and two protected Jewish families only. It was not possible to have a third family. The two families would normally pay tribute to the town for the right to live and work in that town. Even though, let's say, the permission was granted by the crown, it needed to be approved by the town, and the town essentially received the monies from that. The Kurfürst, Frederick III, had tried to settle a third family in Soest in 1696, and Soest said, no, 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 we have laws, and the laws say that only two families, you're going to have to find another location for this third family. And the Kurfürst then withdrew that third family from Soest and did in the end find another town for them to settle in. That is something that is documented. But here in 1704, things are a little bit different. It's now a king, not a prince, and the king is indebted to Esther Liebman, who appears to be either the mother or the stepmother of Wolf Benjamin Liebman. And so we see here the date of 1704, so that corresponds with the documentation that's in Berlin. And we see that not only does he have the right to be in Berlin, but he has or in Soest, he also can bring his consort, his business partner with him. And so his business partner, as we will see, is Jakob Stern, the son of Süßkind Stern. And we can see, this is just very nice, that this document is notarized on the 28th of January, 1705. So it's notarized 321 years ago today. So that's very nice. So how do we know that this is Jakob Süßkind, right? How do we know that the consort is Jakob Süßkind? And I'll just say here, there is documentation. City of Soest, very powerful city in the 13th century, very wealthy city, a Hansestadt on a trade route, on a pilgrimage route. The Jakob Stern settles into this area of the city between these various churches. This is an overview of Soest, again from Google Earth. And you see the remnants of the medieval structure of the city here, where the circular walls once were. This is the location of the Jewish cemetery. This is where the synagogue was. This is where the house of, you will see here, this is the house that Süßkind Stern, that Jakob Stern bought when he moved to Soest in 1704, 1705. This is the earliest photograph of that house in Soest. It is, I mean, part of this, I mean, you have to think that this is an individual who grew up in the Judengasse, in the ghetto, in that kind of dense urban environment in Frankfurt, and is now no longer in the ghetto, right? He is able to buy a house with grounds on a major street in the city of Soest. So this, like I said, is the earliest known photograph. This is from sometime at the end of the 19th century. This is what the house looks like at the beginning of the 20th century. Two different postcards, one where it's very clearly ascribed to the Stern family. And then the second postcard is probably after the National Socialists come to power and the Stern family reference disappears. This is looking up the street to the cathedral. So when Jakob Stern walked out his front door, he certainly would have seen the cathedral towering above the street. This is again early 20th century. And this is what it looks like in 1945, that same view. These are American soldiers in the street. So a great deal of Soest was destroyed, but fortunately not this house. And this is what this house looks like today. I think this photograph was taken just in 2021 or 2022. And this is the inside of the house. So it's quite remarkable. The current owner, Stefan, is on the left here, and my partner is playing Rachmaninoff on the grand piano in the center. And it's quite remarkable to actually be in this house that was purchased by my fifth great grandfather in 1704, 1705. This is the roof construction, which is still more or less original roof construction. And we come back to the documents that are held in the Berlin archives. I pulled the documents. Not all of the things contained in these folders are specific to Jakob Stern, but a great deal is. And so we can see here his name, Jakob Stern, shows up on this correspondence. We can see here again, Jakob Stern, and we have here various dates. We again have Jakob Stern here. This is 1718. There are about 30 years of correspondence between Jakob Stern and the Prussian court, all having to do with financial exchanges, how much money he has to pay, what his rights are, can he bring in his son-in-law, does he have to return to Frankfurt? It's a real sort of bureaucratic documentation. And we see here actually his own signature, Jakob Stern, protected Jew to Soest, right? So this is quite amazing. He, at the very end of his life, returns to Frankfurt and he dies in Frankfurt. And there is a photograph of his gravestone from the early 20th century and a photograph from what it looks like today. It has deteriorated quite a bit. So he moves back to Frankfurt, but his portrait remains in the city of Soest. And it remains in this house. And I guess just to stay on this image for a minute, in this house, because it was a very small community in Soest, there was a prayer room that was built into this house, and that served the Jewish community in Soest for over 100 years. The synagogue was built only in the 1820s, and there was a small room that was dedicated to the school room because at the beginning of the 19th century, there were only two families in Soest. It was the Stern family, and the Marcus Elias Marcus family. And so they're just a few meters apart from each other. There were always large families. The school teacher would live in one or the other of these two houses. The children were taught in one or the other of these two houses, and the prayer room was always in the Stern house. So the question is, was the portrait part of the prayer room? Was this something that anchored the community back to Frankfurt? Was it something that was kept hidden? Was it something that was kept hidden maybe early on and then brought out in the 19th century where Jewish portraiture becomes much more accepted? Those are things that are unknown. This is an image of the Marcus Elias Marcus house. It still exists today. And what happened to this portrait in Soest is that these are the Stern house, the Marcus Elias Marcus house. And what happened was at the end of the 19th century, one of the sons of Marcus Elias Marcus, Robert Marcus, bought another house here, lived in that house for several decades, passed away, and then the house was purchased by one of the sons of Meyer Stern, Victor Stern, and he moved into that house with his wife, his brother, and his 6 daughters. And that house also exists today. And so that is these are photographs from last summer, actually, of that house. And we know that as of 1919, that the other descendants of Meyer Stern who lived in the first Stern house had all passed away. That house was rented out to a construction company, and the portrait then moved to this house. And there is almost no documentation that is direct documentation of it being in this house, except for one passage by the granddaughter of Meyer Stern called Greta Stern, who also became a genealogist, who says that the portrait is in the possession of the Stern family. She lived in this house. This is where the portrait would have been. The Sterns who lived in this house all came to a tragic end. Anna Stern is listed here, and I want to come back to Anna Stern briefly. Pastor and the chemist, I know we're coming up on the hour, I'm paying attention to it. We have the question, what happened then to the portrait? Because this house was at the very end in 1940, 41, it was used as a Judenhaus. So all the remaining Jews in Soest were basically housed in this house, and then they were all deported, and almost no one survived in Soest. Very few did, who were still there at that point in time. So the question is, where was the portrait? How did the portrait survive that period of time? And in this small town called Schwefel, which is really just a tiny village, there was a church and a pastor, and the pastor's name is Jansen. And Jansen there's a fair amount of documentation that, to the public, he conformed to National Socialist politics, but privately, he helped the Jews a great deal. He would ride on his bicycle at night from Schwefel to Soest and deliver food packages. He would send food packages to concentration camps. And his wife was relatively well-to-do and had a large farm. And the understanding is that he hid not only the various religious objects that were saved from the synagogue, but he hid the portraits in the house that belonged, or in the farmhouse that belonged to his wife. And this is a statement made by the head of the Jewish community in Cologne in the early 1950s, just a recognition that he continued to risk his own life in helping the Jews of this community of Soest. And he then, at the beginning of the 1950s, Anna Stern, who had fled to England, returns to Soest. She sells the house that she lived in, the large house, but she returns to the house Stern, to this house, and the portrait was then returned to that house as well. So she lived in that house with the portrait, with other portraits, with some other religious articles that belong to the house. And this is where she intersects Alfred Lawrence. Alfred Lawrence was born Alfred Lomnitz, and he is a relative. He's born in Breslau in 1910. And Alfred is quite an amazing character. He studies law. He can't complete his law degree because the National Socialists won't let him take his bar examination. He goes to France. He goes to Spain. He gets another degree in chemistry. He comes back to Germany in early 1937. He goes to Hamburg. He's arrested by the Gestapo, not so much because he's Jewish, but because he's returning as a Jew, but also because he's a Marxist. He is sent to Sachsenhausen. He spends several months in Sachsenhausen. He then is transferred to Dachau. Then from Dachau, he's released on the premise that he will leave Germany immediately. He leaves Germany with his mother and goes to India. Because he is a chemist, he works for Shell Petroleum. He ends up going to Burma. He comes back. He's arrested for a short period of time, but he's arrested by the British because he's a German. Then he is able to get out of India, and he goes to New York, and then he goes to Philadelphia, where he works for Phillips Petroleum, and then he enlists in the American Army, and he comes back and is one of the junior officers involved with the liberation of Dachau. So one of the first things that he does when he liberates Dachau is he goes into their offices and he finds his card, right? The card from his imprisonment in Dachau. And this is his number. This is his Häftling number, 11,486. And this document is actually from the Arlson archive. And I find this so strange. This must have been, he must have just retyped another card, and with just the comment here that the original card has been taken by its owner, the American Unteroffizier, A.E. Lawrence. He changes his name from Lomnitz to Lawrence. He calls himself Lawrence in honor of Lawrence of Arabia. So he's quite the character. He remains friends with many of the people he's imprisoned with, including Nayux here, Harry Nayux. And you can see that even in the 1960s, when he's writing letters to Harry, he signs it, "Your Comrade." He's the one who, this is why I've dedicated this talk to him, who writes extensively about these two portraits, one in 1971, 1973. And at this period of time in 1970, Anna Stern dies. She's the last Stern family member of this line of the Sterns in Soest, and she dies. And the issue, one of the mysteries in all of this, is that shortly before she dies, the painting, the portrait disappears. And in the article, in the Leo Beck yearbook article, Alfred writes, the full-size oil painting, along with all other surviving Jewish antiques, was sold in 1969 to the servant of the last Soest Stern, by the servant of the last Soest Stern, to the owner of a small secondhand store in Arnsberg, Westphalia. And so what happens is the portrait just simply disappears. I happened to meet Lawrence when I was a young teenager, and he was, the only thing that I remember about meeting him was that he was incredibly agitated that this portrait had just disappeared. This was theft. He had informed Interpol. This was the oldest known portrait. It needed to be found. It needed to be returned. And yet, between 1969 and its reemergence in Frankfurt in the early 2000s, there is no real record of where it was kept or how it was kept or really by whom it was kept, though, of course, the speculation is that it is Horst Hoffmann and that Horst Hoffmann had this small store in Arnsberg, though I've heard other cities mentioned, other towns mentioned. When the portrait appears in Frankfurt, there is a story around that. I won't go into that, but when it appears in Frankfurt, it looks like this. I mean, it was in very, very poor shape, and I very much thank the Jewish Museum Frankfurt for making these images available to me. These are images that were taken by the person who restored the portrait, but the portrait was in bad shape, and if it would have disappeared for much longer, one speculates that it may just simply have disintegrated entirely. And this is what the portrait looks like today in its new frame. Of course, it did not have this frame when it was hanging in Soest or hidden. And just to loop back around to this image here, where it is in situ. And again, who Horst Hoffmann is, what that story is, why he didn't sell it, why Alfred didn't reclaim it, what all of that is something of an unknown. This kind of disappears into the realm of speculation and rumor. There's more work to be done here. So now to close, epilogue. One of the questions, just to bring it back to the Frank family lineage, did Anna Frank know any of this? Did she know even of the existence of the portrait? I think it's safe to say no. Why would she? She was a young girl, a very young girl when she left Frankfurt. I'm sure the Frank family had many other things to be concerned with than a portrait in Soest. Elise Stern is a different matter. She's certainly of a generation, other relatives of whom outside of Soest were well aware of the portrait. So Alice Stern might well have known about the portrait. Did she ever visit Soest? Maybe, maybe not. But she might well have known about the portrait. She might have seen a copy of the photograph that was taken in 1920. so we end on the portrait itself, right? That has had this very long journey. And I find it, for me, it's very odd to look back across, 350 years to this portrait, or 55 years, I guess. And I hope at any rate that this talk and the work that may follow, or that is being done around this portrait, honors the memory of Süßkind. And I hope that he can somehow be aware of this trajectory, this long trajectory of the history of the Stern family. And I hope that in some way that he's very proud and happy with what that trajectory has brought. So with that, thank you.
Ralph, your research is absolutely astonishing and wonderful, and such a compliment, I guess with an E and an I, to the work that so many of us do, and we can learn so much from you. So sincere thanks. That was amazing. We have only a few small questions so far. I encourage people to ask additional questions. One was, is it possible to buy a reproduction of the portrait?
As of now, no, I don't. Should I go out of stop share, or do you want to keep the portrait up?
Oh, I'm sorry. I think maybe turn it off so that we can see you
See me.
at large.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Great.
Wonderful. Yep.
Yeah.
No, I have not seen a reproduction of the portrait. I was in the museum shop of both the museum Judengasse. I don't remember seeing it there.
Okay. But
That's a good
obviously,
question. It's a good question. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's in
You're
the
going next week. You can see, right?
I'll find out.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also it's reproduced in the book, so presumably one could take it from those.
It is. It is. I mean, there is a book on the museum Judengasse, or the Jewish Museum Frankfurt. I didn't include that in this presentation. Maybe I should have, but it is in that book. It is reproduced there.
Yeah, terrific. Another question that came in early on is about gravestones that have been uh, been documented, digitized, which maybe you know about.
In Frankfurt.
I presume Bornaplatz.
Yeah, there is a huge there is a huge sort of file of photographs that were taken in the early 20th century, and the name of that file, the name of the person who did that escapes me, but that is where I took the image of Jakob Stern's gravestone, and that's often where people go back to because they hadn't suffered anything other than deterioration from weather, right, at that point in time. And certainly, even with regard to weather deterioration, there's 120 years less exposure that they've had. So that's actually a remarkable resource. And that's in part why the Frankfurt Jews are so well understood, is because there was so much information that was engraved into these headstones. And what I was told last summer when I was in Frankfurt is that one of the reasons that these particular headstones were not destroyed by the Nazis is that they were considered to be exemplary handiwork done by German handworkers, right? So not Jewish handworkers, then they would have been destroyed, but just German handworkers. So they had a kind of strange respect for just the handwork, even if they didn't respect the cemetery or the Jews who were buried there, right?
Interesting. I could imagine if they have not been if they have not been indexed so far, there could be a project for the JewishGen Jober project, and we can look into that. So we'll
Absolutely,
check on it.
absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's another question. How was the portrait actually found? I mean, how did it resurface?
Well, again, the story that I was told, right? And I mean, I am an academic. I don't, I'm happy to tell the story, but I like to have my own documentation, like give me the document, right? So I have no documentation with regard to this. But the story that I was told is that Alfred continued to agitate for the recovery of the portrait. In the 1960s, he thought that the portrait should stay in Zost and that Stern house in Zost should be turned into a museum, and that the museum would then revolve around the portrait and just, the life of Jews in Westphalia. That, of course, didn't happen. When it disappeared, he did take up correspondence then with the city archivist in Frankfurt prior to the establishment of the Jewish Museum. And there is correspondence with that city archivist. And the story that I was told is that every half year he would write and say, what are you doing? And we need to get this portrait. And so the city archives apparently had some connection to the owner of the secondhand store. And the secondhand store never answered the correspondence. When the owner of the secondhand store passed away, his family then found the correspondence with the with the archive and with the Jewish Museum, with the early Jewish Museum, and said, "Are you still interested in the portrait?" And they said yes. And so that's how it came to be recovered. That's how it came to be in Frankfurt. But again, these are things that I've been told, and I don't have the documentation. There is a very brief documentation regarding the bequest of the portrait by the family to the Jewish Museum, but that bequest is protected by privacy laws, so I haven't been able to see that. So, and apparently there's not much information in it either. I think it's a relatively straight gifting, and that's it.
So one of the other questions, it's really fascinating, is that the portrait appears in the building in the Judengasse and not in the main Frankfurt Museum, correct?
Correct. And again, what I was told was that at first it did appear in the main museum, right? But again, I don't know that. That's an open question to me. If you're going there next week, you can ask them that question, right? How was it situated in that location, and what was how was the decision made to move it to the Judengasse? I mean, in many ways, I think it's completely appropriate in the Judengasse. The unfortunate thing of being in the Judengasse is that it has to be in this plexiglass box because, of course, the issues of humidity and the like, if you have, this kind of, semi-archaeological dig, means that the portrait needs to be protected. And it isn't optimal lighting and the like with regard to reflections and the like on this plexiglass. But beyond that, I think it's really quite remarkable that the portrait is there. And just a few meters away, the gravestone is there. And even though it's not his house, that it's very much like his house would have been like. So, it is remarkable to think of this trajectory over 350 years since a portrait was painted, that it still exists, and it exists more or less where it should be.
There's a message with regard to this, but I could swear that I actually did see it in the main museum at some point, but that could be legend. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, my apologies to Miriam Presler, but there you go, right? I mean,
Right. And another one of the questions is if there might be handouts that are provided with some of the resources that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, it is a question. I mean, I'm in conversation with the Jewish Museum Frankfurt. They don't deal with provenance, right? They finally come down because my question to them was, well, I mean, there's a story here, and why aren't you telling the story? And they just said, well, we don't deal with provenance. Okay. But we have talked about, maybe doing some kind of workshop or some kind of presentation or something. There's still questions that need to be answered here. There's clearly a lot of scholarly work that needs to be done. The question around what did Elise Stern know and when did she know it? And, that to me is really quite interesting. So there are still a lot of open questions here as to what is the complete story here. Obviously, some things we'll never know. But if you are, I guess my position in this is, if you are going to position the portrait there, and the kind of normal kind of implicit understanding is the portrait, if it's here now, somehow it must have been here, and it was here in the beginning, somehow it must have been here the whole time. And I think that's a relatively logical conclusion for people to draw. And the thing is that it wasn't. And, for essentially 300 years, it wasn't there, from, somewhere between 1704 and 1711. And when it came back to Frankfurt in 2003 or 2004, so there's 300 years that it wasn't in Frankfurt. And the story of how it survived and where it survived and why it was moved and the connection to Berlin and all of that, these are really interesting stories. I think it gives much more meaning to how such a fragile object can survive through all of this tumult than simply coming to the conclusion somehow people kept it safe and here it is again.
When you write the book, I would like an autographed copy. And the last question will be about DNA. In other words, the Stern cousins and DNA. Has there been a general project for Stern relatives so far?
No, it's interesting because at least the Stern trajectory, because I often get these questions, oh, I know people who are Stern and, or, I'm a Stern or, but this is the Frankfurt family, the Zost family did well enough for themselves in Zost. The Frankfurt family, I mean, some of them became incredibly wealthy, bankiers, right? I mean, they really amassed great wealth and so there's a different trajectory there. And of course, there are different intermarriages and things like that out of the Frankfurt family. But generally, if you follow the Sterns down, even on both lines, it's relatively defined because the documentation is so clear. And so, for DNA connections, maybe to people who are, not Sterns, right? That might be helpful. But the Stern lineage is a relatively in the end, it's a relatively straightforward one and one that the documentation allows you to trace it quite precisely.
You just reminded me of a story I used to tell. We had a volume, a journal that came out of Leo Baeck Institute. It was called Stammbaum, and the joke was, if you could prove if you were related to me, you got a discount. I was the opposite. If you weren't related, you got a discount, and no one ever asked for the discount. That's
very funny.
what it was. Yeah. Well,
Funny.
thank you so much, both for this incredible lecture and also for the research that you do.